Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. Today's episode is the next in our In Their Own Words oral history series, which explores the lives of scientists who have made great contributions to their fields. This history is with Dr. Osvaldo Sala, who is the Julie A. Wrigley and Regenson Foundation professor and the founding director of the Global Drylands Center at Arizona State University. We had a great conversation, so with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Dr. Sala, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a lot of fun. I mean, I really like BioScience. It's one of my favorite journals, and it's great to have this opportunity to chat with you.
Great, I appreciate it, and thank you very much for the kind words. Why don't we get started with our typical first question, which is, when did you first know that you wanted to work in the life sciences?
Oh, okay. I think before graduating from high school, I was evaluating choices for uh, career choices, and I really had biology was very appealing to me. But on the other hand, I knew they had to earn my living. So I was, my father had died young, and my mother was a school teacher. So it was very clear that I had to have a career that I was going to be able to support myself. So I chose to some sort of an what I thought was an applied biology, and I chose to go into agronomy. So my undergraduate degree is in agronomy because I thought that was applied biology. And from there, then I veered to where I am now. That is just biology.
What sparked that early interest in biology?
Oh, I think the complexity was really very appealing, going from development to ecosystems, and I I thought that that was really very, very intellectually very appealing. And I and as I said, I like it very much, but I was afraid that I wasn't gonna get a job. So
Right.
I decided to do something that was applied, and then I did get a job.
So let's talk a little bit about agronomy. What kind of job, what kind of professional career were you thinking, that you were going to be entering when you decided to pursue that degree? Where did you go to school? That kind of thing.
Oh, I when I yeah, when I graduated, I started working on a consulting firm, and I worked for probably 2 years or so in consulting with farmers, uh, and and this was in Argentina, where I went to college, and I'm I grew up in Buenos Aires, and that was an interesting job, but at the same time, I was looking at I was working. We were mostly working with private farmers and people that my peers that they were, or those that were very successful in this business, are were those that were able to attract a lot of new clients to the firm. And and I was looking at that, and I said, and I realized that the people who attract these new clients were because of social connections. They were in the members of the same country club, or their parents were, or they played. They sail together, and I was from middle class, maybe lower middle class, and didn't have any of these social connections. So it didn't take me very long to realize that I didn't have the right cards to be very successful there. And at the same time, there was this opportunity. I was sort of a opportunity to work at the university there, and I thought that some of my skills match better with the opportunities that were at the university. So I shifted into, and I think it was a good decision. Yeah, I that's how I moved from consulting to being at the university. Yeah.
And I want to jump into what you were working at the university in a second, but just for that agronomy consulting, what kind of work is that? Is that, kind of recommending to farmers what sort of soil amendments they should make, or?
Correct. I mean, and also it was, I don't know, they were all wheat growers. So you have to go and check for pests. So you need to count how many mm, insects there were per square meter. And then they say, oh, you need to spray this with whatever. I forgot. But with what is your treatment? Or this is an important rotation. If you did 3 years of corn, you should do corn now, shift to soybean, or so help them not only with the specific crops, but also with the assemble of different crops and how they should be rotation. So it's a sort of a counseling farmers on how to manage from a biological point of view, like I was telling you about the pest, the fertilization, or to some sort of the economics and management of the farm.
And so, how do you then find your way sort of back into the university, as it were? What's that first job there? What's the graduate work? What do you get into?
This was at the University of Buenos Aires, and I had a very good professor of ecology, and so I went back to work as the equivalent of an assistant for in that at the university. And then there I realized that in order to make progress within the university, I needed to get a graduate degree. And that is when I went to Colorado State University in Fort Collins.
And what was the appeal of Colorado State at that time?
Oh, that was now I tell people that I study ecology, but in those days I went to the range science department. That department doesn't exist any longer. I mean, most universities in the Western United States had range science department, but now those have disappeared. They are not. They are sort of a ecology departments or something like that within the School of Natural Resources.
So, what kinds of things were you actually studying at that time?
Oh, I was studying my thesis. I did a thesis on the importance of small rainfall events. So the basic idea is that in most arid zones, there's a bias to very, very small events. I think that if you think that there is usually 30 events per year in, they say good number, and 20 or so are less than 5 millimeters. And there was, those days, there was this idea of a biologically meaningful rainfall event, that they were large events. And my central question was to try to assess whether that was true or not. What happened with, I said, the majority of the water comes into these very small events, less than 5 millimeters. And what role do they play? Are they useless? Is water that comes and goes, or plants and microbes are able to use them? So I did some experiments where I was creating those, experimentally creating in the field those 5 millimeter events, and then they have different sequences and look at wetting and re-wetting. And indeed, most plants that have that are in those ecosystems are very well adapted to take advantage of those short pulses of water availability. Plants, microbes, they are all ready. It rains, and in hours they are fully operational. They are rapidly growing and fixing carbon, and yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what aspect of arid lands had that initial appeal for you? What really drew you into that system as one that was, worth studying and worth dedicating a lot of time to?
Yeah, so there are several things about it. I mean, I can answer right away. I think the simplest answer is I'm inspired by the openness of the and the big skies of the drylands. So that would be a one line. And also, when I talk to my students these days, I try to emphasize that this idea that we have from very early in our career, we know exactly, we have this long-term goal it's not most of the time what happens. I mean, we go from short term to short term, and we jump from. It's like when you walk in a mountain stream, then there are rocks, and you jump from one rock to the other, and it's not that you are sort of going somewhere, but you are not going in a straight line. And I think I taught a seminary here at ASU, in a career seminar, and I gave my students to read the first chapter of a kind of an autobiography of E.O. Wilson, extraordinary. And he says that he went from he's from Alabama, and when he was 13, he knew that he wanted to study ants, and then he went in a beeline from Alabama to Harvard, and that's all he did. And I said, this is, in my opinion, the wrong model, because it will make all of us in this room, that's my class, feel inadequate, because you don't know what you're going to do. And E.O. Wilson was an extraordinary person, but most of us don't. I think most of us are faced with one or two opportunities and don't take one, and that sort of constrain our path, and then we find another fork. And each time we find a fork, we make a decision.
Right.
And in this case, so I don't know if your career is an E.O. Wilson type career, or is most of us mortals, we go from where things we find what we think is the path. And in when I was in the University of Buenos Aires, I took an ecology course, and that professor was very good, and he invited me to do research in Patagonia. And I wrote my senior thesis in looking at primate production in Argentinian grasslands, and I published it in the Journal of Arid Environments, Journal of Range Management, a long time ago. And this was my introduction to grasslands. Is because he was interested in grasslands, so I didn't have very many opportunities. So I did my senior thesis with him, and then kind of what sounded very interesting. I really liked the ecosystem, and then I went to Colorado State University to Fort Collins, that at that time was the hub of the International Biological Program. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the kind of the first international distributed experiment. I was probably that I went there towards the end of it, but so it was called the IBP. It was funded. It was there was different IBPs for different countries, and the IBP had divided the world in biomes, and they had a desert biome, a grassland biome, and the Colorado State University and Fort Collins were the hub for the grassland biome. That's how I found it. I said, "Oh, I study grassland. I could go there," and I was lucky that they accepted me, and so that was the International Biological Program, and they had a series of publications, and somehow the IBP, in my opinion, was the origin of the LTR network in the U.S. With this idea that it's important to do large scale biology, and that it cannot answer all biological questions in the local scale. You need to compare biomes, and biomes occur across continents and nations. So that was very interesting.
Okay, and so thinking about, that sort of longer term research, I'm wondering what type of a role longer term research has played in your career. Obviously a large one. If you could just tell us a little bit about that. Yeah,
I think the answer could be radically different. If you look at a phenomenon at a scale of a year or 3 years or 15 years, the responses are quite different. And what you see I currently have almost a 15-year drought experiment in the Jornada long-term ecological research project in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And this is such a wonderful example of it. I think that experiment reduces precipitation and increases precipitation. In the first 3 years, the experiment did what you expect. The plants produce, and then the last one there's drought, and more when it's irrigated. And then that went on for 18, 12 years. And then at the 12 years, in the drought treatments, the grasses collapse and disappear. And the shrubs start thriving, and the productivity of the total ecosystem increase in the drought relative to the controls and the irrigated. And this was because of the changes in species composition. And those changes in species composition offset the direct impacts of changes in precipitation. I didn't have the foggiest idea that that was going to be the case. And there was no way to predict that that was going to happen. And the only way to do it is to have those long-term experiments. And
that must have been very surprising, because I mean, for my layperson's non-understanding, it would simply be that if you put less water into an already arid system, you would not expect to have more productivity.
Yeah, the first year or two that were getting more productivity, I look at the data and I ignore them and says this is a blip on the data set. I should just forget. But then it became more, and then so this is basically telling you that the bottom line is that it increases in climate change has a direct effect and may have some indirect effects through changes in species that it may or may offset the effect of climate change or accelerate it. Jerry Melillo and the Harvard Forest had a long-term experiment that they did soil warming, and you expect that soil warming was going to increase soil respiration because of more or less the same reason. The crops. Then you see the pictures, and then you have it's all covered with snow, except the patches that are being warm, and indeed, they found an increase in soil respiration for 11 years. And after that, they stopped. And they started, then the warm plots and the controls had the same level of soil respiration. And that was a big surprise. And once you look at it in hindsight, now you say, oh, okay, so all the labeled carbon was burned out, and then there's no more carbon to burn, and therefore respiration, the effect of temperature stopped. But nobody thought about this until we had a 12-year experiment.
Yeah, and it sounds like the kind of thing that you would really want to know, especially if you're going to be kind of running a global scale climate intervention by pouring a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere. But there's no way to do it without this long-term research. You just no way to know what's
absolutely. You are absolutely right. That's absolutely key information, because we can bet this is what is going to happen to ecosystems and how much that directly affects the carbon balance of the planet. So no, you are absolutely right. This is critical information, but it's very difficult to get and very expensive. And there are not very many sources of long-term funding in the U.S. Most of us have 3-year grants, and it's very difficult to support long-term experiments.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Let's jump back a little bit and talk about that first postgraduate job. What's the first professional kind of being a professor, teaching, and that sort of thing. How do you find your way into that one? Because I think that's something a lot of our early career listeners will be interested in.
Oh, okay. After I finished my PhD in Fort Collins, I went back to Argentina, and I got a job as assistant professor at the University of Buenos Aires. And I stayed there for 2 years. And then there was political collapse in Argentina, and then I found a job in Colorado State University at the National Natural Resource Ecology Lab, and I worked there for 2 years, and then I went back to Argentina, and then I started teaching there, and that was how, and working in research. I went back to Patagonia, so that was my research was inspired by that professor. His name was Soriano, and he was the one who inspired this interest in grasslands, and in this case, the Patagonian steppe.
Could you talk a little bit about what it was like, either more recently or back then in that early career stage, doing research in Argentina? Because I note that sort of international collaboration is a major part of your career, and something that you've done a lot of work on. But I'm kind of wondering for those who are sort of U.S. based and tend to view things through sort of a U.S. lens, we don't have the perspective of what it's like to do science elsewhere in the world. So could perhaps tell us a little bit about those types of experiences.
My impression is that the students in Argentina were and are very bright and very curious. The resources are always scarce. Things that are sort of common for us, from access to library, access to journals, and all those things are much more difficult there and scarce. And here you are working in the lab, and you I don't know, you need a little washer and just turn on and write to Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos delivers by the end of the day, and then you keep working, and that is much more difficult in the developing world.
Yeah, I would imagine that would have been a challenge. But do you think it was particularly valuable for you in your career to be able to sort of compare similar dry lands across different continents? Because a lot of times what I end up talking to people about is they've really keyed in on one spot, and they've really looked at it intensely.
Yeah, I think it formed my view of ecology. Working in Patagonia, I work also in South Africa. I work in North America, and in North America, I work in Colorado grasslands. Now I work in the grasslands in the Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico. And then I spent 2 years at Stanford, was a Guggenheim Fellow, and I worked with annual grasslands in California. And so all that sort of created, without me knowing, sort of a broad perspective of grasslands, drylands, grazing lands, and people too. Different. The ranchers of Colorado are very different than the nomads of China or people. And so all those, that was me just entering through just being in different places and not doing it on purpose
and following the next rock in the hop across the creek, as it were, in whatever direction it might lie.
So you like that metaphor?
I do. I think that's a very powerful one, and it kind of speaks to descriptions that I've heard from many others as well. Who also have that similar experience of not knowing exactly what the next step is going to be, and we wind up talking a lot about the issue of serendipity and just sort of taking advantage of opportunities as they present themselves.
Yeah, and also I think that is very important for early career people, that because as much as I admire E.O. Wilson, he is not the right example. It's make us all feel inadequate, and if you don't know, and sort of give us that even if you don't have it, you can get to the end to the origin of the creek or the stream, but may not be a straight line. Had some sort of a long term, but also be aware of all these other opportunities that may turn out to be great opportunities.
That makes sense. What ultimately brought you to Brown?
It's a combination of things. I mean, there are different answers to that question. I think Brown University was trying to develop, launch something called the Environmental Change Initiative. Was kind of a center, interdisciplinary center across different departments, from geology to biology to the social sciences. And at that time, I also had some experience leading this international organization. I was the president of something called SCOPE, the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, that was headquartered in Paris. And so I had some experience with interdisciplinarity. I wasn't upset talking to sociologists, and I can drink beer and wine with them, and I can and I think Brown wanted to have an interdisciplinary project in environmental sciences, and I thought that this was kind of like a good opportunity for me to move into this. Brown also was a great experience for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm really interested in that, focus on interdisciplinarity, because it's something that we talk a lot about now. But was it talked about as much then? It sounds like it probably wasn't something that was conducted as much then.
That is, those are the two key words that you say: talk and conduct. Say, so there was a lot of talking, but very few walk the talk. Like, just to give you an example, I mean, everybody says that their universities, their programs are interdisciplinary. Nobody says we are not. We're
No one says we're in a silo. We don't talk to anybody outside.
We don't know.
Yeah.
No, but then yeah. Nobody says I'm not. I'm for. This is the come to the silo university, but then you see, for example, that where tenure is. So there's a lot of these interdisciplinary centers, and there are hundreds of them across the nation. But there are multiple modes of doing that, and one is that you keep the string of power into the anchor to the traditional department. The power is tenure, money, space, and so this is okay. This is an interdisciplinary activity, but who decides who gets tenure, promotion, salary? All those are in the traditional departments, and decides who allocation of resources, money, space. Then you don't have an interdisciplinary program. You have an interdisciplinary program in talk, but not in walk, because people know. I mean, if this is the department who's going to decide how much I make, if I get tenure or not, I'm going to be an active member of that department, not of the interdisciplinary unit. And that is very interesting, because you almost can predict the success of this interdisciplinary units. I mean, success means truly creating an interdisciplinary environment by the degree of bottom up or top down efforts. So universities and systems that are mostly bottom up it's very difficult for them to develop interdisciplinary programs. Why? Because each group has all the rewards to maximize the return to their silo. So if you are a chemistry professor, you need to maximize the number of students that go through chemistry. Your rewards are not in collaborating with the sociologist.
Right.
So so you almost can predict how much it is, because and then in order to get a truly interdisciplinary program, you need to go from the top down. And I remember this anecdote that the chair of the engineering department went to talk to the provost at Brown, and his name was Bob Zimmer, and now is the president of University of Chicago. He says, I need two faculty lines for whatever. And Bob told him, I'll give you 4 half lines. Go talk to Osvaldo for the other half lines. So, so it forced him to, yeah, have us collaborating. And this, he did the same thing with economics. He did the same thing with many other opportunities. And that only comes from the top down.
Right. It can't. I mean, it can't work if if all of the loci of power are within the departments themselves. And yeah, that makes sense.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering, what kind of work were you doing there? What was the product of this interdisciplinary collaboration? What kinds of things were you investigating?
Oh, my research was always focused in drylands. I had NSF funded projects, then they were all the only difference, instead of driving, we were flying here to the Southwest for the summer, or so. Our field work was all in the drylands, and we hired a lot of people that were very diverse, and they were trying to create that an environment of collaboration, of understanding each other. And it was early on, but I think it was pretty successful.
Yeah, and what kinds of things do geologists, sociologists bring to bear, in that kind of research?
All the issues of global change are prime for interdisciplinarity, because you cannot think about the carbon cycle without taking into account the geological component and biophysical component and biological component. And so those are, and of course, social component. And I had a lot of really great colleagues in there, and I worked with the people that were, I remember, sociologists that were, I still keep in touch with them and collaborate, and looking at very large scale phenomena like Katrina. I mean, this hurricane, and has clearly social component. It clearly has, and that has sort of left an impact on me, to be able to think like a sociologist or think like a geologist. And it's kind of scary somehow, because you most likely you're going to say things that are pretty stupid, or they're very well known. So the interdisciplinarity carries out this. You have to encourage people to make mistakes. They don't, and if they are not making enough mistakes, it's because they're not taking enough risk. And it's easier just to be in a very narrow field where you are pretty certain you know everything there, or
more than everybody else.
More than everybody else. Yeah, exactly. You said it really well. But if you start working with a sociologist and trying to say something and writing proposals that are interdisciplinary, you very quickly run into saying things that are well known, or you're wrong, but it takes some intellectual courage to go into those unknowns, or unknowns for me, and they all of them have to agree, okay, so we're going to work together, but we're going to accept that the other one doesn't know much about what we know a lot.
And if you fail to do that, you're at the risk of not being able to understand systems in a way that allows you to kind of look out over a long future. For instance, you can't make predictions about biodiversity in 2100 if you don't do that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Let's now kind of talk a little bit about what you've been working on recently, and as perhaps a continuation of things that you've done before. But what sort of things are you doing right now?
Oh, okay. I have a lot of fun projects. I think I talked a little bit to you about this long-term simulations of climate change, where I've done changes in precipitation for the next for 12 to 15 years. So we created experimental drought. We created experimental deluge or very wet conditions. And also we have a lot of work that we've done trying to separate the effect of changes in the mean from changes in the variance. So let me explain a little bit more. I mean, we know, and then the newspapers know, the public knows that in addition of our planet getting warmer or drier or wetter, we are going to move into a planet that is much more variable. There are going to be more droughts, more wet conditions, but the droughts are going to be followed by extreme wet. So the extremes are becoming the norm. And so I've tried to separate the effect of the extremes from changes in the mean. And even though the extremes are very popular in the press, I mean, that's what people read about climate change as a heat wave. There is this, then. But however, we scientists have mostly studied the impact of changes in a given quantity. There are hundreds of, thousands of papers that have looked at what is the effect of increasing 2 degrees temperature, or doubling CO2, or reducing precipitation, or increasing precipitation. All those are changes but changes in the variability, regardless, they can have also very, very important and impacts on ecosystems. And somehow studying the extremes is an excellent window to see the impact on the future, because some of the extremes in 2022 resemble what is going to be the norm in 2100. And so I think I'm trying to address that question with experiments in the field, with observations, and I also do simulation modeling. And simulate this modeling allows us to go for hundreds of years. You can simulate and increase the precipitation variability, for example, and look what is most important. You say the degree of those extremes or the duration of the extremes, and you can answer those questions, or at least provide some guidelines to develop experiments to finally test those questions. So that's kind of the things that we're doing.
That sounds like really exciting work. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about scientific societies and the leadership thereof. It occurs to me that that's a role that is incredibly difficult. It's a very challenging managerial task. And unlike many of the other things that scientists are trained to do, this is something for which you might not necessarily have the same kind of preparation. And I'm just wondering what it's like to jump into that experience, kind of from the get-go, and without necessarily having been formally trained in the task.
Correct. You're right. I think I told you, was president of SCOPE, president of the Ecological Society. So I work with 4 or 5 societies in sort of different leadership positions, and it is remarkable how they changed throughout my career. I think the Ecological Society of America, for example, the reason why I joined them sort of disappear now, because I was very interested in receiving the journal. That was ecology. That was when I was a graduate student. But now that was one of my motivations. But now I think that motivation disappeared. Everything is online, and everything can be reached from no matter where you are. Even if I'm writing a paper, I'm here. Over there is my bookshelf. But sometimes it's easier for me to click here than go to my bookshelf. And it is here. So I don't go to the library very often. And so societies have changed in several respects. And so I think that it become more and more important as a voice representing their members in front of institutions. So let me give you an example. When I was president of the Ecological Society of America, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, was started this policy of allowing only one proposal submitted per person per year. I think the rationale was that they were overwhelmed with proposals. The system couldn't handle that, and so the Ecological Society thought that was an issue that affected their members, because their members thought that was negative in many respects. First, discourages interdisciplinarity, because if you only can submit one proposal, people rapidly migrate into the silo and try to support their own major area of research in their lab, but it cannot afford to use that card to collaborating with other people. I mean, and it certainly discouraged in new ideas that are kind of high risk. And so, as president of the Ecological Society, we talked to NSF. We wrote letters with other organizations like American Geophysical Union, and we presented a voice that represented a large group of our biologists and ecologists, and they couldn't have done that individually. So that is an example of the new role, what I think is a very important role of societies. It's representing our members in front of institutions, in front of the society at large.
Yeah, that makes sense, because otherwise, you're not, in a position to kind of reach those bodies, from your own office at a university.
And also can go back, and it can be communication in both directions. If the National Science Foundation or the Department of the Interior or anybody wants to know what biologists think about that, they cannot just write to biologist.com. You have to go through these organizations, and that is sort of how our society is organized. And
yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of something a friend in the Foreign Service said one time, which was that somebody said to him, why don't people just pick up the phone now that we have this great communication? He said, well, there's got to be somebody on the other end of the line to pick it up.
yeah, yeah, and it's very complicated when we're very many, and we're filtering. So the societies have changed enormously. I still think that the one of the prime roles of societies is to create and support those opportunities for meetings, for communication. And I think even you and I are having this great Zoom conversation, but it's difficult to replace the one-on-one conversations and these casual ones that usually yield these great new insights.
Yeah, that makes sense. Scott and I were just talking the other day about how the fact that nobody's sparked any brilliant collaborations over a Zoom meeting. It's they serve their purpose, but it's not the same.
Correct, and also because it chops all the informal relationships. I mean, I can have a meeting with a student or a collaborator about something, but all this spontaneity doesn't exist in Zoom. I'm not going to have a Zoom with you for 2 minutes or 5. It's too much work. So all those little sort of a small conversations disappear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Once you have a basis for the conversation. I'm just being conscious of the time. I want to ask you a couple of kind of quick, shorter ones. If these spark an interesting memory, feel free to jump in. If they don't, we can just skip it and move on to the next one. But I was just kind of wondering, stuff like what was your best day on the job, if you had to highlight a single one?
Oh, I think I got a lot of real pleasure when I can work on manuscripts and sit with an idea I can think shallow, but if I stay start getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to the essence of a problem and all of a sudden when I see something that I didn't see at the beginning, that gives me some sort of a special reward. I don't know if it's some sort of a oxytocin coming out of my front lobe, but I do feel that pleasure of discovery. It doesn't need to discover something big, but discover how this paragraph works, or discover what is the essence of this manuscript. This is, I mean, wordsmithing is no, I don't enjoy that, but trying to find a story, trying to find a story that is meaningful, that is creates a lot, gives me a lot of pleasure. Does it make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. It's well reflected in your writing too. But it's an interesting answer that I don't think many scientists would give. People often feel a little uncomfortable with the writing of manuscripts.
And I think I learned that part of from my advisor. His name is Bell Launroth, and Bell also he's a deep thinker. He can think about problems deep and for a long time, and not very many people can do that. You need to learn to sit there and think about the same thing. Stay there, keep thinking. You think you know, but just stay, and don't move until you have to have some sort of a faith that something is going to happen. Sometimes nothing happens, but sometimes after some time you start seeing things from a different perspective, and that's where you get those meaningful changes. Or
Yeah, and that actually leads me directly to one of the next, kind of shorter questions, which is, what are the big differences maybe in the way that science is conducted today versus, the way it was earlier in your career? Is that time for reflection and deep thinking about hard problems? Is that something that has fallen by the wayside, perhaps?
Yeah, I think we are forced to these mini small. We work in very very small chunks of time instead of working on
Yeah, instead of working on longer term thoughts.
yeah, and for example, I'm writing a proposal with a colleague now, and I told him it's just I'm going to turn off the email, my phone, and for this morning I'm going to work on this proposal, and I'm ignore everything else, and then I just couldn't do it for 5-10 minutes, and went downstairs, get a cup of coffee, and then, but I couldn't open the email, can't open, and then it just started getting into what I was trying to do, and it got the whole that is qualitatively different view. I can feel that, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to do that. But I don't have I don't have the opportunities now. I have an hour talking to you, but I have to write 2 promotion tenure letters. I have to do all these other things that is part of my job. So I'm okay, but it's and most of my research is fit in between those gaps of doing other things. So I think that's sort of a change that I think that we become more conscious. We should be able to proactively control.
No, that makes sense, and that's something I think all of us struggle with in one sense or another. Even right now, I'm also playing the role of audio engineer as well, so I'm having to look at this other screen while we're talking. And I wish we were back in the good old days where we'd be in a nice recording studio with 3 engineers handling the whole thing on our behalf. But
yeah, I certainly wrote fewer papers than I write now. I crank many more papers now, but I think the depth that I think there was different. I think.
And I guess one last question: if you had to give advice to, people early in their careers right now as scientists, what kinds of things would you tell them? What sorts of things should they be looking forward to in the future as, at least ways to anticipate those next steps that they might take, even if they don't know exactly the direction that they'll be in?
Oh, I think I would say enjoy every bit of it. This is a lot of fun. And it is fun to discovery is fun. Being in the field is fun. Writing papers is fun. Just look at the fun thing, and you're gonna do okay. You're gonna do great. And think about James' metaphor of the creek and going from one rock to the other. Don't need to think about how long is the creek. Just go from one rock to the other.
I like that. And I really do enjoy that metaphor. And I would also just like to thank you very much for joining me today, Dr. Sala.
All right. Excellent.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.